ready to wrestle with some big questions about faith in the modern world.
We're diving into Francis Spufford's Unapologetic, not your typical theological text.
We've got a stack of his most pointed arguments, surprising anecdotes, and even a bit of humor, because apparently faith doesn't have to be boring.
What struck me most about Spufford is how he tackles the elephant in the room, right from the start.
Oh, totally.
He talks about how his own young daughter is going to realize this about him sooner or later. And it's not about being a bad person. It's about faith itself seeming out of place in our modern world.
He compares it to choosing all things bright and beautiful over Star Wars. Guess which one seems more relevant to today's world?
It's a brilliant comparison because it highlights how Christianity is often perceived as outdated, irrelevant, even a little uncool, especially when compared to the more individualistic, self-help-oriented spirituality that's popular today.
And Spufford doesn't shy away from that perception. He leans into it. But he then challenges this idea that faith is somehow at odds with enjoying life.
He takes on that atheist bus slogan, the one that says, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life."
You've seen that one, right?
Absolutely.
It's so pervasive, this idea that happiness is simply about removing obstacles and anxieties.
But Spufford argues that this is a very shallow and ultimately unsustainable view of the human experience.
It's like that saying, life is a beach. Just kidding, it's a frickin' tide pool.
Exactly. Life is inherently messy and unpredictable. We face challenges, we make mistakes, we experience loss and disappointment. Spufford argues that trying to build a philosophy of life solely on the pursuit of pleasure is like building a house on sand. It's just not going to weather the inevitable storms.
And that's where his concept of HPTFTU comes in. Have put things frightfully up. It's basically the story of being human, right?
Precisely. It's not just about making the occasional mistake. It's about recognizing that we are fundamentally flawed and limited creatures. And this isn't meant to be a depressing thought, but rather a liberating one. Because once we acknowledge our own HPTFTU-ness, so to speak, we can stop striving for an impossible standard of perfection and start accepting ourselves, imperfections and all.
He uses this great example of Field Marshal Montgomery.
Here's a guy, a war hero, who even late in his life is suddenly overwhelmed with guilt about the deaths he caused during the war. Even if those deaths were, in some sense, unavoidable given his position, the weight of them, the HPTFTU of it all, still haunted him.
And it's important to note that Spufford isn't saying Montgomery shouldn't have felt guilty.
He's highlighting that even our most necessary actions, even those undertaken with the best of intentions, can have unintended and often painful consequences. It's part of the human condition, this interconnectedness of joy and sorrow, success and failure.
It's like we're all constantly trying to navigate a world where we can't fully predict or control the outcomes of our actions, even the good ones.
And that's a reality that many modern philosophies, especially those that emphasize individual autonomy and control, often fail to adequately address. We can't just think positive and wish away the difficult parts of life, but perhaps by confronting them head on, acknowledging our limitations and seeking grace, we can find a different kind of peace.
Okay, let's unpack that idea of grace a bit more.
This is where Spufford really digs into what sets Christianity apart.
So how does this idea of grace, of finding peace, even within our very human messiness, actually work? Spufford gets into some fascinating territory here, especially when he talks about those moments when we seek comfort, maybe through prayer, and nothing seems to happen.
He uses a powerful analogy, comparing it to a soldier crouching in a foxhole, praying for a miracle while the bullets are still flying. It's that feeling of desperate hope clashing with the stark reality of ongoing suffering.
It's like the opposite of those feel-good stories, where someone prays for a parking spot and suddenly one appears. Spufford is dealing with the silence, the absence that so many people experience when it comes to faith.
And he doesn't try to explain away that silence. In fact, he describes a moment in a church where the silence itself becomes a kind of revelation.
Really?
He talks about it being almost shockingly loud, as if by quieting his own internal noise, he becomes hyper-aware of the world's immensity and complexity.
He describes it as becoming attuned to the smallest details, the weight of the wood and stone in the church, the labor that went into crafting them. And then his awareness expands outward, beyond the church walls, to the streets, the fields, even the vastness of the universe.
It's a beautiful image of how stripping away our preconceived notions and expectations can open us up to a deeper, more profound experience of the present moment. It's like the difference between looking at a photograph of a forest and actually standing in the middle of one, feeling the breeze on your skin, smelling the damp earth, hearing the rustling leaves.
And through that experience, that immersion in the realness of the world, Spufford suggests that we can begin to sense something beyond the material, something that both precedes and sustains it all.
He grapples with how to describe this sense of divine presence, using metaphors like being seen from inside or being read by what I'm made of. It's not about seeing God as a separate entity, but rather experiencing a kind of universal awareness, a grounding presence that permeates everything.
And he's very honest about how this experience can be both comforting and terrifying.
Comforting because it suggests a sense of ultimate belonging, of being held within something much larger than ourselves, but terrifying because this awareness is also totally unflinching.
Yeah.
It sees us completely, without illusions, with all our flaws and contradictions laid bare.
It challenges those comforting but ultimately simplistic notions of a God who simply shields us from the harsh realities of life.
Spufford is suggesting that true faith requires a willingness to confront those realities, to acknowledge our own imperfections and vulnerabilities, and to trust in a love that persists despite them.
Which brings us to that perennial head-scratcher, the problem of suffering. How can a loving God exist in a world where bad things happen, often to good people? Spufford dives right into this one, doesn't he?
He does. And he doesn't offer any easy answers, but he does provide a powerful framework for thinking about it. He argues that any concept of a loving God must encompass the totality of existence, the beautiful and the terrible, the joyful and the painful. He uses this striking image of a universe filled with both kittens and anthrax spores to illustrate this point.
It's a jarring juxtaposition, but it really drives home the point that we can't just cherry-pick the parts of reality that fit neatly into our understanding of a loving God.
Exactly. Spufford challenges the idea of a God who micromanages events, shielding his favorites from harm while allowing others to suffer. He argues that genuine love cannot be manipulative or controlling. It has to allow for freedom, even if that freedom sometimes leads to pain and heartbreak.
So instead of asking, why do bad things happen to good people? Maybe the question becomes, how do we find meaning and purpose within a world where suffering is an inevitable part of the human experience?
And that's where Spufford finds hope in the figure of Jesus. But, again, he doesn't present a sanitized, feel-good version of Jesus.
No, he's really pushing back against that, isn't he? He insists that to truly understand Christianity, you have to grapple with the radical and often uncomfortable idea of God becoming human.
He challenges the idea of Jesus as simply a nice guy or a moral teacher. He presents Jesus' teachings as a call to radical, vulnerable love, a love that embraces risk, acknowledges our inherent HBTFTU-ness, and persists even in the face of suffering and loss.
It's a love that doesn't offer any guarantees, but instead offers a path through the messiness and uncertainty of life.
And that path leads us to what Spufford calls the scandal of forgiveness.
The idea that there's a way out of guilt and the crushing weight of our past actions.
It's not about ignoring the consequences of our choices, but rather about accepting that we are capable of change and growth.
And this idea of forgiveness isn't just about our individual relationships with God, but also about how we relate to one another.
It's about recognizing that we are all flawed and messy creatures, capable of both great love and great harm. And yet, despite our imperfections, we are all worthy of compassion and forgiveness.
It's a high bar to set, especially when we look at the history of the church itself. And Spufford doesn't shy away from that, does he?
No.
He dives right into the messy and often troubling track record of Christianity.
He confronts the hypocrisy, the violence, the abuse of power that has been all too common throughout Christian history. He doesn't try to sugarcoat or excuse any of it.
But he also argues against the notion that belief inherently leads to bigotry and oppression.
Right. He points out that Christianity, like any human institution, is shaped by the cultures in which it exists.
He uses this incredibly vivid phrase, hoovering up culture, to describe how Christianity absorbs and reflects both the positive and negative values of the societies in which it operates. This explains why Christian history is such a complex mix of light and shadow, of profound love and horrific cruelty.
Yes.
And yet, despite all of its failings and contradictions, Spufford still sees the church as a force for good in the world.
He describes it as a community of feck-ups striving to live out a love that transcends our limitations, a love that's always a work in progress. He emphasizes that the church isn't an exclusive club for saints, but rather a place for all of us, struggling with our HBTFTU, trying to figure out what it means to live a life of love in a world marked by both beauty and pain.
And that brings us to Spufford's conclusion, where he reflects on the ongoing tension between doubt and faith. He emphasizes that Christianity isn't about certainty, but about trusting in a love that persists despite the lack of guarantees. He talks about finding God in the everyday in a world of supermarket trolleys, as he puts it.
He's suggesting that faith isn't about escaping from the world, but about finding glimmers of the divine within the ordinary, within the messiness and uncertainty of our daily lives.
It's a challenging and inspiring vision, and it leads us to that final provocative thought that Spufford leaves us with.
He leaves us wrestling with this question. If the church is meant to be an embodiment of Christ in the world, where do those who find themselves both drawn to and repelled by its complexities and contradictions fit in?
It's such a resonant question for so many people today, right? Feeling called to something bigger than themselves, yet maybe turned off by the baggage and judgments that sometimes come with organized religion.
Exactly. You see this tension playing out everywhere, from people questioning traditional doctrines to those struggling to reconcile their faith with their experiences of the world.
It reminds me of something Spufford said earlier about faith being a kind of bet. Not in a gambling sense, but more like a wager on how we choose to see the world.
He argues that we're constantly perceiving a state of the universe, not creating one with our beliefs. So the question becomes, what lens are we using to make sense of it all?
And he's clear that this isn't about blind faith or ignoring the hard questions. He actually encourages us to lean into the messiness, the uncertainty. It's like he's saying, come on in, the water's fine, even if it's a little murky sometimes.
It's about embracing the inherent mystery of existence and acknowledging that we may never have all the answers. But within that space of not knowing, there's also a profound sense of freedom.
Freedom from having to have it all figured out, freedom to wrestle with doubt, freedom to embrace the HPTFTU of it all.
Precisely. And that's what makes Spufford's Unapologetic such a refreshing and ultimately hopeful read. It's not a book that tries to convert you or tell you what to think. It's an invitation to engage in the messy, often challenging, but ultimately deeply rewarding work of figuring out what it means to live a life of love in a world that's full of both profound beauty and heartbreak and pain.
It's like he's giving us permission to embrace the complexities of faith, to ask the hard questions, to doubt, to question, and to keep searching for those glimpses of the divine, even in the most unexpected places.
And perhaps through that searching, we might just discover that the most important answers aren't found in doctrines or dogmas, but in the quiet spaces between our doubts, in the messy realities of our lives, and in the radical, unflinching love that binds us all together.
That's a powerful note to end on. So there you have it, a deep dive into Francis Spufford's Unapologetic. We hope this conversation has sparked some new insights, or maybe even just given you permission to sit with some of those big questions a little longer.
And remember, the journey of faith is just that, a journey. There's no finish line, no right or wrong answers, just a constant process of exploration, discovery, and growth.
So keep diving deep, keep asking those tough questions, and keep seeking those moments of grace and connection in this wild, wonderful, and often perplexing world.